Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. Before we start the interview, I'd like to offer you a gift. I work with many queer folks who struggle with self-esteem, self-acceptance, and confidence. And I get it. Growing up queer is no cakewalk. Living in a world filled with homophobia and oppression can take its toll. Having the strength to be true to yourself can be a challenge, but you can change that. So, if you'd like support taking the first few steps, head over to my website and grab your free copy of The Self-Confident Queer. Just go to queerhealingjourneys.com/confident. This guide will walk you through 3 simple steps to help you begin to build your self-worth and confidence today. So head over to queerhealingjourneys.com/confident and download your free guide today. Okay, now on with the show. Today on the show, I'm speaking with Gwion Raven. Gwion is a tattooed pagan, writer, traveler, musician, cook, kitchen witch, occult shop owner, and teacher. Although initiated in 3 magical traditions, Gwion describes his practice as virtually anything that celebrates the wild, sensuous, living, breathing, dancing, ecstatic, divine experiences of this lifetime. Born and raised in London, England, he now resides in Northern California and shares space with redwood trees, the Pacific Ocean, and his beloved partner. Today we talk about Gwion's book, The Magick of Food, Rituals, Offerings, and Why We Eat Together. He shares about growing up tasting foods from around the world in his East London neighborhood and how he weaves alchemical magic into cooking. We also talk about creating special meals with gods and ancestors, whether you're alone or in community. Learn more about him and his book at gwionraven.com. That's GWIONRAVEN.com. Hi, Gwion. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. I'm so excited.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here and talk about your new book, which actually it's not new now. It's a little bit over a year old. Mm-hmm. And The Magick of Food, Rituals, Offerings, and Why We Eat Together. So I wonder if you could start out by sharing with us what inspired you to write this book.
You know, it's an interesting question, Nick. There's a lot of things. So from just a food perspective, I love food, been fascinated with food for as long as I can remember. Where I grew up in London, there was proverbial melting pot. To the left of the little town that I grew up in was an area that was a massive Hindu and Pakistani contingent. And then on the other side of where I lived, there was this massive contingent of folks from the West Indies, Jamaica, and what have you. Where I lived, there were a mix of different folk, including folks that had immigrated from Cyprus and Turkey. So as you can imagine, there were 1,000 different spices that were not fish and chips, right? You know, when people think of English food, they think of fish and chips, right? So there were all of these amazing spices. And, you know, I'm naturally gregarious. I had quite a few friends when I was younger, and I would, you know, go to people's houses and there were all these different foods that I'd never heard of and different customs in the way you eat them. Some you eat on the floor, some you eat with a spoon, some you eat communally, you know, so all of these different experiences that were not sitting at the kitchen table at 6 o'clock having meat and 2 veg, you know. So I've always loved food. As a magic worker, I think that food, if you look at any culture in any time period, if you look at the laws and the rituals and the prayers, anything that's connected with that culture, there's always food. Every myth has got some hero that's got to find the magic cauldron or, you know, whatever it might be. So there's always this element of food in many magical myths. And then if we think about the way that we typically celebrate ritual as a magical community, we often do it around food. And so I thought, I'm going to marry all of those together in one book. And then lastly, over the years, I've talked to hundreds, maybe thousands of people about their daily practices. And one thing that nearly always comes up is, I don't have time for a daily practice. I get up in the morning and I have a cup of coffee, or I don't do rituals with food. And then they find out, oh, but when somebody's sick, the first thing I do is make that tuna noodle casserole that my grandmother used to make for me. And so it became apparent that people were they were combining magic and ritual and food and not necessarily realizing it. And so, again, this book speaks to this notion that we can create magic every day with the most simple things that we do. And food is one of those areas that most everybody has access to much of the time. Mm-hmm. So that's why I wrote the book.
Great. Yeah. Well, I love how you dive into the history of different cultures and their relationship with food and ritual. And then, bring us ideas about how to bring that into our current culture. But one of the things that you mention in the book, and I've also heard you speak about before, which I really love and I'd like for you to share, is the ways that we can have meals with a god or a deity.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite things. So the gods. Again, whenever we think of stories, I bet if you were to name most gods, goddesses, otherworldly beings, there's some story about food. They love honey as an offering, wine as the food or the drink of Dionysus, right? So I'm going to use Dionysus and Bacchus, even though they're distinct, they're somewhat connected. Mm-hmm. I'm going to use Dionysus as an example. So I think if you want to have a relationship with a god, just like perhaps if you wanted to have a relationship with a person, you might invite them out on a date. And that date might include going to dinner. And depending on how the date went, if this was a second or a third date, maybe you invite them back to your place and you cook for them, right? That's pretty common, right? Mm-hmm. So what if you just did the exact same thing with the gods? Now, if we were going to invite Dionysus to dinner, we could put Taco Bell on the table. And I'm sure that Dionysus would be like, okay, great, Taco Bell, that's nice. But
people eat that when they're drunk, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. You see where I'm going with this. But what if we said, well, what would Dionysus recognize? So when we look at the myths and the stories of Dionysus, what kinds of foods were served? Was it lamb? Was it all vegetables? Was it wine? Was it grapes, right? And if we think about Dionysus, we can think about sort of Mediterranean foods, because not only was he in Greece, he was also around the entire Mediterranean area. In some of the history, there's this idea that they're not quite sure which came first, but wherever the vine traveled to, there Dionysus was. And so if you were going to have a meal with Dionysus, if I were going to have a meal with Dionysus, which I've done several times, I want it to be sumptuous. I want there to be red velvet floor coverings or tablecloths or things that are just delicious and sumptuous to the touch. I think Dionysus is one of the queerest of the gods. So I would want a rainbow of food, because I think if Dionysus were hanging out with us this afternoon, Dionysus would absolutely be part of queer culture today. He just absolutely would. So a rainbow of fruits, meals that he would have recognized, and yeah, just tons of wine. And I would want to put the wine in maybe like a brass ewer or a carafe or something that could be poured sloppily so it got everywhere, and I'd eat with my fingers. Dionysus, I find, is one of the most sensuous and sensual of gods. And so the idea of eating with my fingers, if I was just eating just me and Dionysus, serving myself, getting juices all over me. If we were eating a meal together and we had all of the consent and good boundary discussions prior to that, but the idea of me feeding you or you feeding me would be rapturous, And then I think some modern touches. Dionysus wouldn't have known chocolate, but I think Dionysus would adore melted chocolate, So things like that. So, and if you look at any god that you are either connected to or you would like to connect to, I think if you go back and study where they were from, when they were from, who worshipped them, who brought their rites to them, what the rites consisted of, you can construct a meal with the foods that they love. Again, Nick, if you and I were to date, or I was going to have you over for dinner, and I knew that you loved Italian food, I'd cook Italian food for you. You would be appreciative of it. It would hit your palate just the right way. If we were going to take our relationship further than that, you might say, I do like this Gwion. He knows how to satisfy me with, those great cannolis, whatever it was. I think it's the same thing with the gods. If we tempt the gods with the foods that they love and they recognize, they're more likely to show up for our rituals and our rites. And what better way to get to know someone than over a glorious meal? So I love dinner with the gods. I've done it with, Dionysus frequently. Basically, if you just think of him, he'll show up. He's one of those gods. But Inanna as well, Demeter and Persephone. There are certain foods, Thor, goat legs and, things like that. Yeah. With Bacchus, it's just anything over the top. Anything that, afterwards you could think, oh my God, I want to die. I've eaten so much food. And you've got, glistening fat all over your chest or something. Anything like that. Bacchus is all over.
Yeah. Now, I will confess I haven't finished reading the book yet, but for people who are interested in doing something similar to this, but maybe don't have a connection with a god or a deity, do you talk a little bit about eating with ancestors? Because that's also something that is fairly common among different pagan practices.
It really is. And I actually think this is one of the best ways. I'm going to tell you a little story. So about 100 years ago, when I was a young boy, I would go over to my grandmother's house frequently. My mum was a single mum, and she worked on the weekends. So being able to go over to my grandmother's on a Friday and stay until a Sunday night was good for me. It was great for my mom. It was good. Almost every Friday night, there was a game show on that came on about 8 o'clock at night. It was very popular. And my grandmother and I used to watch this show. Prior to that show, she would cook dinner. And frequently on a Friday night, we would have marrow fat peas, which are big, thick English peas. We'd have some steak, which was quite rare in England at the time that people ate steak the way they did. So we'd have a little beef fillet, and then we'd have chips. So I have really fond memories of sitting on a little step stool while my grandmother was cooking, and we'd grab the plates, take them into the living room, sit with TV trays, and we'd watch this game show. And it's just a very visceral memory that I have of her. And I absolutely adored my grandmother. And she's gone now. When she was dying, she asked that any time the family got together, that we raised a glass and we gave a particular toast. And I've done that now for 17 years or something like that since she's been gone. So by the power of YouTube, I've gone on and I've actually been able to find old versions of that game show. So a few times, like on my grandmother's birthday, I've set up my laptop in the kitchen. I've put on that game show with the theme music and the ridiculousness. It was kind of like game show and a variety show. And I cook with my grandmother. And I cook that steak and chips meal that my grandmother made so many times on a Friday night. So what I'm doing is I'm using the foods, and food is smell and taste are the senses that are most connected to memory. So as soon as I smell English malt vinegar or mint that goes on the peas, as soon as the pan gets hot, I hear the sizzle of the steak as it hits the pan, and I hear that theme music, like all of a sudden it's very easy for me to picture her home and me being there with her. And I start having conversations with her. Hey, man, I'm cooking steak and chips. Look, the game show's on. Do you remember? And then I tell her stories that I remember of our time together, of when she was alive. And I think many people have got some memory of an uncle, an aunt, a parent, a brother, somebody in their life they watched cook food, somebody that took care of them, that always gave them Oreo cookies, whatever it was. There's some memory connected to food. You might have a 3x5 card that's got, Grandma Sophie's brownie recipe on it. It doesn't matter what it is, but there's some food. And then if you don't have those specific memories, maybe your life circumstances, you didn't grow up around family, for instance, maybe you know something culturally. So you know that your people are from this place, this country, this region. You can cook food from that region and use that as the entry point into culture. You can use that as the entry point into memory. You can use that as the entry point into connecting with your ancestors. Uncle Joe, I know you loved shepherd's pie. I'm going to make shepherd's pie. It might not be quite the recipe that you used, but I'll make a shepherd's pie and we'll sit and we'll eat off of that plate that was gifted to me from your family. You know, whatever it is, there's ways that we can begin to touch into our ancestral memory by eating foods and maybe cooking in the ways that our ancestors would have. And again, if you don't know who your ancestors are, you've got a vague idea, this can be a great way to begin to connect into that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One other story that I'll tell briefly in the book, I only mention this in passing. I really wanted to write more, but I was asked specifically not to share too many of the secrets around this practice. But something that I think as a queer man that really has been impactful for me, there are specific dinners that started in the 1990s. I was not part of them then. I didn't find out about these until the 2000s. But in the 1990s, really in the height of the AIDS crisis, there were meals where all of the food and drink and decorations, as much as possible, were red. And the idea was this red was the good, healthy blood that would sustain people. And these became toasts, you know, that we would drink to the vibrant red blood because so many folks in primarily the gay community, but all across the queer community, so many people were dying of AIDS. And, you know, as we all remember, there was no really government intervention on that. You know, it was terrible. And so these dinners started off as a way to use the healing magic of healing foods, whether they actually had healing properties or not. You know, this sympathetic magic of having red foods and red wine and red tablecloths. And then the aspect of having community as well, friends gathering. And then these became almost memorials. You know, all of a sudden somebody didn't make the next dinner because they were too sick to attend or they had died. And so it became a way in the toasting to not only toast the vibrant blood, but to say the name of the friend or lover that had gone or was going. And so I think that's also a way I still do those dinners from time to time, just personally. And occasionally in the magical community, I'll be part of one of those dinners. It grew beyond the queer community and it grew beyond AIDS to any of the kind of bloodborne diseases, you know. And I think there's a real power in coming together knowing that if it were me that had one of those diseases, that people might gather and say my name and remember me as I've remembered others. So yeah, like that's another way to connect with ancestors.
Yeah.
And that's in more of a communal way. Maybe it's more community ancestors than familial ones.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing all of those different stories and those different ideas. And one of the main reasons I thought it was important to talk about is because, you know, many queer people can feel isolated and lonely because they may have been, you know, rejected by their family or their community because of their identity. And so I think it's important for us to come up with new ways to connect and not feel alone, even if we're not physically with a god or an ancestor or, you know, a friend who has passed in some way, but to know that we can still connect with that sense of community or not feeling isolated. And especially right now, since many people at the time of this recording are still so isolated in quarantine and social distancing, that there are ways that we can still connect in a non-physical way with people that we can't be with in person. So yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that we might sort of tie in with this is one of the things that you do in the book is you share recipes from different members of the community. And I wonder, you know, if there was anything special that you noticed about gathering those recipes or what that was like for you to bring that aspect into.
Yeah, you know, so here's the interesting thing about recipes. I've never received a recipe from somebody as just the instruction manual to cook a dish. Right? So if you think about what a recipe is, how long it takes, the measurements of what you need, and then the instructions of how to heat it or, you know, whatever is being done with it, right? How we prepare it. At no point has anybody just handed me a piece of paper or a thing from a book and said, here you go. Every cook, Every chef, every food person I've ever worked with always tells me a story. And what's much more important than here's how you make coq au vin, or here's how you make, Gwion's favorite shepherd's pie, or whatever it is the story that goes with it. And in different communities, there are different stories that go with different meals. A good friend of mine, a chef by the name of Karen McKay, gives this sort of, I call an unrecipe for this particular soup that she makes. And it's a soup that chef friend that she knew cooked. It was always a little bit different every time. Whenever I smell that soup, I immediately think of the first place I ate it, which was this redwood dining hall in the Mendocino woodlands. As soon as I smell those spices and flavors melding together, I'm immediately transported to that dining hall. I think that's where you and I first met, Nick, which is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I think about the story that goes along with that food. I think of the 1,000 people that have gathered over the years in that spot doing food blessings. That particular soup, I think, is nearly always served on the first night. And when I've cooked in other communities, when I've been part of the kitchen team, I've brought that recipe and that story to those places. And so that's this thing about sharing recipes. It's got very little to do with the food that ends up on the plate. And it has everything to do with this recipe means so much to me because. And it's the because that's the interesting bit. And when you talk about isolation, technology is an amazing thing. So we have to be, most of us, I think many of us, are isolating because we have to right now because of COVID. Like you said, throw in distance, throw in weather, throw in lack of familial support, right? All of those things that might keep us isolated. We can do Zoom meetings or Skype meetings or whatever platform you use, but we can do Zoom meetings and cook together. Over the past year, I haven't been able to gather with friends. It's one of my favorite things to do is gather in a kitchen and eat. So I've had Zoom dates where we've cooked together. We've agreed ahead of time to get the same ingredients and roughly cook the same meal, and then put the laptop or the iPad at the end of the table and go, look, here's my version of it. And the other person does the same thing. And then we're sharing the same meal. So, obviously they might bounce off of our palates a bit differently, but generally speaking, if I'm eating sweet corn, you're eating hot buttered sweet corn. So we're having the same kind of experience in the moment. I mean, that's an amazing way to connect. You can still eat with people, even if you're, 1,000 miles apart or in the apartment next door, but you just can't visit them because of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that. So for me, that's the essence of a story, of a recipe. You tell me about your grandmother and why she cooked it and how she cooked it and how it made you feel. And, whatever. That's for me. Or you're imparting some part of your culture. I'm from this part of the world and this is the way we make this thing. That's amazing. And that binds us together. Whether it was our ancestors who gathered around the first hearths 1.8 million years ago, or whether it was you eating at the newest bougie restaurant in town, whenever you last were able to do that. We've never forgotten as human beings. We love to sit around fires, whether those are actual fires or stovetops or barbecues or whatever they are. But we love to sit around fire. We love to share food and we love to eat with each other. That is literally in our DNA. And we keep doing it. We're just finding new ways to do it now.
Yeah. Well, a couple things I want to say about that. One is the way you started that, which is like rarely do you get a recipe that is just the basic food instruction, but there's always like a story that goes with it. And it really makes me think about, truly the magic of food. And that is like alchemy, which is a form of magic. And so I think that can be a way for people who maybe feel disconnected to food or feel disconnected to cooking their own food, and they want to bring some kind of whimsy or a way to sort of generate more interest in it, is to think of it as alchemy and to try something new, especially, with the cultures that use a lot of different spice combinations and that kind of thing. The way that, like, I know when I first started cooking Indian food, I was just like, oh my God, this is so complicated. And you have to roast all these spices and do this and that. And there's all these different steps. And then at the end, you're like, wow, I never realized that, like, A, this spice that I'm putting in with all this other stuff would even go with it. And then B, that it would taste like this in the end. And an example of this is not really in the spiritual magical realm, but I was recently looking up recipes on Japanese curry because I really like that. And I found this one recipe, and the author was talking about how actually in the Japanese Navy, curry is a very common dish that they serve there, and that each different naval ship has their own version of the recipe. And, so that's one of the things I also really like in cookbooks when they do sort of what you're talking about at the beginning of the recipe. They tell a little story and they say, well, this is how I first came upon this, and this is the way that these people did it, and this is how I'm doing it, but feel free to do with it what you want, right? And like they were adding cheese and coffee and all sorts of interesting things to it that I'm like, I would never imagine you would put that in curry, but I guess that would be okay. So,
yeah.
Yeah, it's a way to be creative and expressive and find your own way with it. So,
well, and you said something really important at the beginning of this, I guess, as a magical practice. So if you think about a classic magical spell, what do? You grab herbs and spices and a dash of this and a drop of that, right? Eye of newt and wing of bat, all of that. And what do? You then stick it in a mortar and pestle and you grind it or you boil it or, whatever it is that you do with it. That's magic. That's when you think of a classical magical spell, you gather the ingredients on the right day, in the right season, and then you transform them somehow into an elixir or a paste or a potion or, whatever it is. That's cookery. That's absolute cookery. So if you're a great magician and you're not so confident in the kitchen, just take your magical practices and do the same thing in the kitchen. It's nothing more than a spell. Likewise, if you're listening to this thinking magic, I don't know how to do magic with food. Well, if you know how to cook and you know how to follow a recipe, that's a spell. All you have to do to make it a spell is add in intention. And the intention is the bit where you say, and with this food, may it nourish those who eat it. Or with this food, may this heat the temperature of our conversation and lead to love, or, whatever it is that you're making this food potion for, this magical meal for, is you just simply you state the thing that you want it to be and put that. You often hear an expression, if you watch any food shows, that you can taste certain recipes made by one person will taste different, and the missing ingredient is love, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some cooks I know dislike that as a metaphor because it's like, yeah, but burnt chocolate chip cookies can be filled with all the love in the world and they still taste terrible, right? So there is something about doing good cookery as well. But if you think about it, that really can be. If you didn't feel well and you wanted chicken soup, for instance, if I made you chicken soup, I'm going to fill it with herbs and spices and all the things that might actually bring you healing, things like turmeric and garlic, things like that are good for you, right? There's some science that goes into it. There's this interesting thing that happens with chicken, especially if you've got some bones in there, where certain chemicals are released that really do help with healing. And there's some good science behind that. And then there's, you're laying in bed feeling glum, but I'm in the kitchen cooking you chicken soup. That actually begins the healing process physically, not just, in that woo magical way, but you're being taken care of. Where your next meal is coming from. That means you can focus on getting better. I feel good because I'm doing something for a friend, for somebody I care about. I'm making them a meal. I'm being particular about it because I really want it to be a good soup so that it helps you heal faster or better. And so there's an exchange. That's my intention. I want you to feel better. Your intention is, I'm going to eat this food with gratitude because I didn't have to make it and I'm not starving. So that's an entire magical alchemical process right there, from the picking of the herbs and spices and ingredients to the heating of them. That's alchemy, to the transforming it from just this bowl of ingredients into a delicious soup. The alchemy of all the ingredients melding, and then the alchemy of me adding my intention and you receiving it with that same intention. That's magic from top to bottom. Mm-hmm. That's really what food witchery is all about.
Yeah. So I know that you did a lot of research and you talked to a lot of people in the process of writing this book, because I literally saw that happening. I had the pleasure of seeing you in process a few times. And I wonder if there were any unusual recipes or unusual food facts that you discovered on your journey of researching this that you want to share with our listeners?
Oh my gosh, what a great question. Unusual food facts. I don't know that it was unusual, but a common thread I found amongst folks that really wanted to pack food with flavor is miso.
Mm-hmm.
Adding miso to things that you would never think of. I made a really homey meal the other day. It was a request. Somebody wanted me to make them tuna noodle casserole, right? Like I didn't use Campbell's soup, cream of mushroom soup, but it was pretty basic, right? But what I did is I used my own vegetable broth, and I did put in a healthy amount of miso. And that was something that I found a lot of cooks and a lot of chefs use, is those big flavor components. Miso just adds a meatiness, if you will. So if you're a vegetarian and maybe you haven't always been, and so you miss maybe that unctuousness, fattiness, meatiness that you sometimes get with meat, using miso is a really great way to replicate that without it being, meat-based. Mm-hmm. So that was one thing, that there were a lot of folks, and time, not the ingredient, time, the aspect, whenever possible, cook as slowly as you can. Mm-hmm. Let something cook for 4 hours. Instapots are great. I'm not a fan, but in my life, I have the ability to usually cook a meal for several hours if I need to, and I realize not everybody has that luxury. So Instapots and those kinds of crock pots are amazing tools because they compress the shrinking, the cooking time. But if you have the luxury of time, take time. And this is just a cookery secret. Add more salt than you think and add more butter than you think. Any cook will tell you why food tastes as good as it does when you go to a restaurant. There's much more fat, butter, oil, and much more salt than you ever imagined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I think about the quality of time, it's always low and slow, is what works well. And it's funny because miso is actually a secret ingredient in one thing I make as well. And I was just like, oh, this is really good. Mm-hmm. I find that any of those complex sort of fermented things, they can just, even just adding a little bit of it, or like, fish sauce is another one of those things that you just add
That's right.
a drop into some soup, any kind of soup almost, and it just changes it magically, speaking of alchemy.
That's right.
So, Gwion, I wonder if you can share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish.
Yeah. So I think this is...
Or food.
Or food. Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, all foods help my queer spirit flourish because I'm a bit of a hedonist, so I love really sumptuous, delicious, velvety foods, so I love that. But as far as people, I'm going to say, generally speaking, for me, every kitchen that I've worked in over my lifetime or volunteered in, there's nearly always, predominantly, I've found queer people cooking. And I think that speaks volumes. In fact, I can't think of a kitchen that I've been in the last 15 years where there wasn't at least one other queer person than me. And I think that says something. I think that says something about our culture. I think that says something about cookery in general. Part of being queer, not to be overly stereotypical, but I think we choose our own family. That's often the case, not always, but it's often the case that we have to choose our own family. And a kitchen brigade, a crew in a kitchen, is family. You begin to rely on people in ways both inside the kitchen and outside of the kitchen. I think because there's not always been support and is not always support for the queer community, queer people have to find ways to support each other. And food is a really great way. There are obviously folks on every end of the spectrum, from folks that have more money and resources they know what to do with, to folks that struggle on a daily basis just to find food. And what I find is in a lot of those volunteer situations, in community food outreach, there's nearly always queer people. I think because we know that you can't always count on the systems of government or mainstream society to provide those things. So yeah, I think really I would say something that has allowed my queer spirit to flourish is to be part of kitchens where being queer is accepted, maybe even expected. And so I would say being part of kitchen crews over the years has really enabled me to step into that. And magic, at least kinds of magic that I practice, the magical communities that I'm part of. This is absolutely not true, but it seems like every other person is queer. So, and I love that. Right. Mm-hmm. In all the flavors that we get to be queer.
Yeah. And also just bringing it back to that community thing is like being in a kitchen is automatically you're part of a community and you have to work together and you're all creating this magical alchemy of making food together.
It's true. Languages develop, shorthand, communications. It's brilliant. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Gwion, where can people find you and learn more about you and find your book?
Oh, thank you. So the Magick of Food, Rituals, Offerings, and Why We Eat Together is available just about everywhere at this point. So if you have a local bookstore that you can get to, that's always lovely. It supports the local bookstore. You can order it from the big conglomerates online that you want to order it from, if that's the easiest thing for you to do. You can find the book anywhere. It's published by Llewellyn. You can find me at either gwionraven.com, and my book is available there as well. I co-own a magical shop in Sebastopol, California called Milk and Honey. So I'm there occasionally, and you can order the book from there as well. And as far as finding me out in the world, it's at gwionraven.com. You can follow the Magick of Food on Instagram or on Facebook, and that's Magick with a K. So you can find me there. And yeah, I'm pretty easy. If you type in Gwion Raven, I show up all over the place. There aren't many people called Gwion. There are fewer people called Gwion Raven. I think I'm the only one.
Great. Well, I will have all those links in the show notes so people can find them there. But thank you again for being here and sharing with us the magic of food.
Thank you ever so much. It's been my pleasure.
To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.